Good morning. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Dr. Tobias Gibson, and I'm an associate professor in the political science department. I have been asked today to introduce Dave Zirin, named one of Utne Reader's 50 visionaries who are changing our world. Dave Zirin writes about the politics of sports for The Nation magazine. He is their first sports writer in 150 years of existence. His most recent book is the acclaimed Game Over: How Politics Has Turned the Sports World Upside Down, which Christine Brennan of USA Today called the perfect book for our time in sports. Zirin is the author or co-author of the following books: The John Carlos Story, The Sports Moment That Changed the World, Bad Sports: How Owners Are Ruining the Games We Love, A People's History of Sports in the United States, Welcome to the Terror Dome, The Pain, Politics, and Promise of Sports, and What's My Name, Fool? Sports and Resistance in the United States. Zirin has brought his blend of sports and politics to multiple television programs, including ESPN's Outside the Lines, MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show, and Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. On a personal note, 6 years ago, I read Zirin's Welcome to the Terror Dome, and to be honest with you, it rocked my world. Reading that book profoundly altered the way that I view the intersection of politics and sports, those things, those seemingly disparate loves of my life at the time. Since then, I've read much of his work, and even when I don't always agree with him, I always find him to be profound. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dave Zirin to Westminster College. Thank you.
How's everybody doing? This is great to be here at Westminster. I've never spoken anywhere that had a moat before in front of me, so approach very gingerly if you want to come up afterwards for the question and answer session. Some alligators, it's okay, nothing too scary. I always like getting a beat on the audience I'm speaking to before I start, so if you could help me out here, by a show of hands, can you tell me how many people here would describe themselves as absolutely rabid, psychotic sports fans? Okay, some people. All right, keep note of the people who would describe themselves as psychotic. That's a little weird. Second, how many people would describe yourselves as casual sports fans? You feel like you know what's going on. Wow. And how many of you would rather shave your head with a cheese grater than hear somebody talk about sports for 40 minutes? Over there, please. What's your name? What's that? Frida. Okay. Hi, Frida. Now, the goal for today, what I hope to do in the next 30, 40 minutes, and then 20 minutes of Q&A, is to do a talk that engages the psychotic sports fan, the casual sports fan, and Frida. If we can do that, then we'll get this done. Now, just so you know something about me, I mean, I grew up one of those absolutely psychotic sports fans in New York City in the 1980s. My room was like a shrine to the stars of that time. People like Dwight Gooden, Darryl Strawberry, Lawrence Taylor, Keith Hernandez. I didn't know at the time they all had serious drug addictions, but that part didn't really matter. But seriously, my room, in retrospect, was like the Scarface cocaine all-stars, and somehow I made it out of that in one piece. And, you know, I played sports. I was a very serious baseball player growing up. I was the starting center for my high school basketball team. We sucked. I mean, I'm 5'10". That's not what you want in a center. I really, looking back, I played or tried to play every sport except for, you know, golf, which of course is not a sport. I'm not trying to offend. Remember, there is a moat. It's just, I really truly believe from the bottom of my heart that anything that you can smoke cigarettes or gain weight while doing is not a sport. Like, that's the line for me. So NASCAR is a sport because you don't want to be smoking cigarettes when you're driving that car. Softball, of course, is a sport. Beer league softball, if there's a keg on every base, not a sport. So it's a good way to understand what's happening. And I never really cared too much about politics growing up at all. And sports and politics, to me, if you had asked me, would have gone together like Albert Pujols and the California Angels. It wouldn't connect in any way that made sense. That's obviously a joke only for here, so that's the pandering joke. But it would make no sense to me whatsoever that these two things would walk together side by side. But that changed for me very dramatically when I was in college. I went to Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. It was very cold. 1996 was the year, and there was a player for the Denver Nuggets by the name of Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. And Rauf made the private decision that year that he wasn't going to come out for the national anthem before games. And this went on for about 3 or 4 games before anybody noticed. And of course, this is before Twitter or social media or whatnot, so it wasn't the sort of thing that people were picking up on or talking about. But a local reporter in Denver realized that Rauf wasn't coming out. And so he went into the locker room and said, "Hey, Mahmoud, why aren't you coming out for the national anthem?" And he said, "Well, it's just not my thing. I'm not very comfortable with the bringing together of patriotism in sports. It makes me uncomfortable, and I feel like I have the right to exercise my freedom of choice to not go out there." And then the reporter, like all good reporters, asked a good follow-up question, said, "Well, don't you realize that flag is a symbol of freedom and democracy throughout the world?" And Rauf's response was very interesting, and you could actually find it on YouTube. You'll see his face, and he has this look on his face like, "Should I say something? Yeah, I think I'm going to say something." And he says, "Well, it may be a symbol of freedom and democracy to some, but it's a symbol of oppression and tyranny to others." Now, when he said this, there was just a huge uproar in the sports world. And once again, back then, before we're all online looking for the latest thing and hitting updates on our phones, what we would do is we would run back to our dorm at 7 p.m. to catch SportsCenter and find out what the latest was on Rauf. So I remember being there, watching it with all my friends, and ESPN went nuts with this story. They were like, "Rauf spits on the flag, booyah, dan-an-it, dan-an-it," and we were all like, "Whoa, this is crazy." And I'll never forget one of the talking heads on ESPN said, "Rauf must see himself in the tradition of activist athletes, people like Muhammad Ali or Billie Jean King or Bill Russell or Tommie Smith and John Carlos." And I remember seeing that and thinking to myself, activist athlete? What the hell is that? I mean, I thought I was this big sports fan. I thought I had all the statistics memorized. I could name all the Cy Young winners dating back 30 years, and I had no idea what they meant by activist athlete. So, I hit the library, I started reading old articles, I started reading old athletic memoirs, and I came to learn that you had this amazing hidden history in sports of athletes who used their hyper-exalted, brought to you by Nike platforms to actually try to say something about their world, to use the cultural capital that they were given as athletes, many of them from very poor and working class backgrounds, many women, many people of color, and they decided to say, "You know what, I actually have a microphone in my face, I'm going to use it for something other than trying to sell people sneakers." And learning about that history was, for me, it was unbelievable. It was like walking into an intellectual wind tunnel. And at that point, all I wanted to do was learn more about this, and I basically spent then the last 17 years studying this, writing about this, doing a radio show about this, and trying to figure out ways to make this history relevant to the 21st century. Now, one of the things that I figured out that was particularly jarring was that a lot of what I thought I knew about sports history wasn't actually true. And that was the first thing, was just trying to get the truth about history and about sports history in particular. Like, for a big example of that for me was Jackie Robinson. Like, just out of curiosity, how many people here saw the movie 42? It's a lot. And there's a lot of very good things to say about 42. There also are at least 42 things wrong about the movie 42. And you could do a catalog list of everything that, from a historical perspective, they get wrong. And it actually starts with the opening line of the movie, where there's a voiceover of someone who says, "Jackie Robinson, the first man with black skin to play in Major League Baseball." Now, that's actually not true. Major League Baseball was actually integrated after the Civil War in this country, and it only became segregated when everything in American life was segregated with the defeat of Reconstruction after the Civil War in the 1870s. And this is, I think, a very important part of our history, because oftentimes the history of race and racism in this country is presented in a very schematic way, where you have segregation, integration, celebration. Yet the reality is actually much more complicated. So after the Civil War, you have integration in all the sports. I mean, in 1875, the Kentucky Derby, 16 of the 17 jockeys were African American. By 1890, it was entirely white. Major League Baseball was integrated. Defeat of Reconstruction, bam. All of a sudden it becomes whitened, and African American players like Moses Fleetwood Walker are physically pushed off the field of play. And it's really a history that I think people need to know, because what it presents is the idea that maybe the history that we've been taught did not have to be this way. That maybe there were opportunities for a better approach, not just to sports history, but to the entire history of race and racism in this country. Now, the other part about Jackie Robinson's history, which once again is not mentioned in the movie 42, but it's something that I think is so important, is that there was actually a mass movement in this country in the 1930s to integrate Major League Baseball. And one of the people who led it was somebody who you wouldn't necessarily see in a Hollywood film, a gentleman by the name of Lester Red Rodney, who was the sports editor of the Daily Worker being the newspaper of the Communist Party of the United States. Now, obviously, Hollywood is not going to be like, let's do a movie about the Communist Party in the 1930s. That'll bring in, people into the theaters. But the history itself is actually fascinating, and it's something that really did happen. Like in the 1930s, organized by Lester Rodney, there was a petition campaign to integrate Major League Baseball. They got over 1 million signatures, delivered it to the desk of the commissioner of Major League Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis. They would do things like have parades where they said end Jim Crow in baseball, and they would march down the streets of cities like Chicago and New York, and even actually in St. Louis as well. This movement existed. And it's part of the history of what pushed Major League Baseball to realize that there had to be a change. Now, I actually had the opportunity to interview Lester Rodney before he died in 2010. He lived to be 96. He was sharp as a tack till the day he passed away. He was somebody, he left the Communist Party when he realized the extent of the crimes that were taking place in the USSR. But his contribution to actually integrating Major League Baseball is something worth knowing. And I'll never forget, I interviewed Lester, and he was so humble about his own role in this history. I mean, he knew Jackie Robinson. He knew Jackie Robinson's family. He's arguably, this is somewhat disputed, but he may have been even the first person to scout Jackie Robinson and bring his attention to Major League Baseball. But I remember telling Lester Rodney, I mean, he was 95 at the time. He sat with me for 6 hours, and he said, "Why are you even talking to me about this stuff? Young people don't really care about this." And I said to him, "Well, actually, I think they do, and I want to travel around and tell people about your story and what you did in the 1930s. And he said to me, to be 80 again, which I thought was very, very cute in its way. But the other part of Jackie Robinson's history, to take it there, that I thought I knew but wasn't actually true, is that I was raised with this idea, and there's a lot of this in the movie 42, that Jackie Robinson was someone who, quote unquote, did it the right way. That he kept his mouth shut, he took tons of abuse from other players, he took abuse from his teammates, yet he somehow just shouldered through. And he made it, and by just the example of his suffering, he was able to show people that African Americans had a place in Major League Baseball. I mean, the reality is that Jackie Robinson was actually a barnstorming speaker for civil rights in this country. He was one of the marshals at the 1963 March on Washington, for example. In the 1950s, he was a barnstorming speaker for civil rights. He was actually the most requested speaker in the United States by southern branches of the NAACP. The number 2 most requested speaker was someone you might have heard of, a guy named Martin Luther King. But this is actually in the records of the NAACP. And I find this so funny because you imagine people sitting around, and the same way, your professors and students plan this symposium and trying to think about speakers and who you can get, and people saying, okay, we need to rally the troops here. Can we get Jackie Robinson? He's busy. All right, let's get Martin Luther King. Damn, okay. God, we almost got Jackie Robinson. Let's get King. I mean, it's just amazing to me that you don't hear that about Jackie Robinson, that Martin Luther King was the silver medalist in terms of speakers who people wanted in the 1950s. And Jackie Robinson would always end his speeches the same way. He would say, if I had to choose between the Baseball Hall of Fame and full citizenship for my people, I would choose full citizenship time and again. And that would just bring people to their feet. So that's the Jackie Robinson story. Another person whose history I certainly thought I knew, but was not nearly close to the history as it actually was the person who said, you know, I hospitalized a rock, I beat up a brick, I'm so bad I make medicine sick. Ah! Now who was that? It was Muhammad Ali. You see, that's amazing to me. This is like almost 50 years ago, and still it's like the answer, Muhammad Ali. People know that name. I mean, he's even referenced in that horrible Katy Perry song, Roar. People know that song? Like, there's this part in it where she's like, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and it's just like, wow, Katy Perry. She might not even know who he is, but she knows that line. It's just an amazing thing. Like, his cultural resonance exists to this day. And I thought I knew Ali. I thought I knew who he was. What I didn't know is that in his time, he was by far the most polarizing, the most hated, the most despised athlete in the United States. I mean, you think about somebody today like Johnny Manziel. Johnny Manziel doesn't have nothing on Muhammad Ali in terms of what he had to deal with. If you had like a death threat Olympics of athletes who people actually took the time to write letters to saying that I want to see you die or I may do it myself. I mean, Muhammad Ali would win that very easily. And so why did Muhammad Ali have so much hate? Why did people hate him so much? I mean, because he was an athlete who during the 1960s, during this incredibly tumultuous era, had one foot in the African-American freedom struggle and one foot in the anti-war movement, the most famous draft resistor in the history of the United States. And this in and of itself made him someone who was that hated. And it was all symbolized by the fact that he said, my name is no longer Cassius Clay, my name is Muhammad Ali. I mean, the New York Times actually had an editorial policy. He changed his name in 1964. The New York Times had an editorial policy, and people think of the Times as a liberal newspaper, that they were not allowed to call him Muhammad Ali in print until 1970. So for 6 years, the New York Times is calling him Cassius Clay, or Cassius Clay who likes to call himself Muhammad Ali. And what's so interesting about that is going back and interviewing people from the 60s, whether you called him Cassius Clay or Muhammad Ali actually was a way of saying where you stood on the key political issues of the day. Like if you were on the side of the United States in the war in Vietnam, or if you wanted the United States to pull out. If you were on the side of a growing African-American freedom struggle, like, so you would have people in a barbershop talking about, like, hey, who do you like in the fight? I like Cassius Clay. Oh, I like Muhammad Ali. And that alone would set a political room on edge based on what you called him, what his name was. I mean, that's how electric he was. And it really is unbelievable to look back and look at how the media talked about Muhammad Ali, largely because today he's the closest thing we have, I think, to a walking saint in this country. And the amount of hate he got in the 1960s is unbelievable. I actually have a little section I wanted to read you here. This is a column by a very famous sports writer, arguably the most famous sports writer of his era, a gentleman by the name of Jimmy Cannon. And Jimmy Cannon was a kind of like one of those guys you see in the movies with a little fedora and a cigar, and he would talk like this, you know. And this is how Jimmy Cannon wrote about Muhammad Ali, and of course he calls him Cassius Clay. This was in a column in a newspaper for people to read. He wrote, Clay fits in with the famous singers no one can hear, and the punks riding motorcycles, and Batman. I don't know why Batman was so dangerous, but that was like a thing then, I guess. And the boys with their long, dirty hair, and the girls with the unwashed look, and the college kids dancing naked at secret proms. I didn't go to that college, for what it's worth. And the revolt of students who get a check from daddy, and the painters who copy the labels off of soup cans. There's an Andy Warhol reference. He was probably like, what did I do? And the surf bums who refuse to work, and the whole pampered cult of the bored young. I mean, that sounds like something like the Unabomber would write. But this was what was somehow acceptable to write about Muhammad Ali. And what's so amazing is the way he captured this entire era of the 1960s as being this figure of not only great rebellion, but also a figure who was somehow sanctioned and okay to despise. And of course, he had his title taken away from him in 1967. And he, without even losing, he didn't have his title for the next 4 years. And what's so amazing about him, and this was part of the history I learned, is that in 1968, he had his passport taken away. He'd been sentenced to 5 years in Leavenworth. He was out on appeal. And in 1968, he could have holed up in his house. I mean, everybody had turned their back on him at this point. He decided to go on a campus speaking tour. And during that year, he made 200 talks on college campuses. You think about that, that's 4 talks a week for 50 weeks. And you go back and you look at the footage, and it's really amazing, because he would always end his talks by saying, like, can they take my title without me being whooped? And everybody would yell out, no, no. And you'd say, who's the real champ? And people would go, Ali, Ali. So you had the New York Times not calling him Muhammad Ali, but you had masses of college students around the country chanting his name. And then by the 1970s, he actually then becomes a figure of reconciliation, of the country coming back together. And this is, to me, part of the things that's the hardest thing to get my head around sometimes. Because it's like, you think about 5 years ago. I mean, it's 2013, 5 years ago is 2008. That doesn't really seem like that long ago to me. In 1970, Muhammad Ali is still trying to get back and fight. He's still facing 5 years in prison in Leavenworth. And the city council of Louisville, the city where he was from, actually voted to say Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay, is no longer a citizen of Louisville. We renounce his Louisville residency. He no longer is a Louisville person. And Muhammad Ali was kind of like, can they do that? I am kind of from there. By 1975, the main thoroughfare, one of the main thoroughfares in Louisville, is called Muhammad Ali Boulevard. And it still is known as Muhammad Ali Boulevard for this day. Richard Nixon ordered Muhammad Ali's phone to be bugged. Gerald Ford invites Muhammad Ali to the White House. I mean, so an amazing transformation of his persona in a short period of time. And the reason for that was it was generally recognized that on the issues of the day, he was more right than wrong. Right to say that the War of Vietnam was a mistake. Right to say that people had the right to be angry about racism in this country. And the fact that he was able to use this platform as the most famous athlete on earth to do it, to me, is just earth-shaking and mind-boggling. But the thing about Ali also, which I think sometimes we decontextualize and don't realize, is that he was just one of the most famous athletes in the United States who are also political. I mean, if you think about who the most successful athletes were of all time, you think of people like Bill Russell for the Boston Celtics, 11 championships in 13 seasons. Arthur Ashe, tennis player, former coach at Army, which I learned from your school president, which I did not know, which was amazing to learn. A player like Jim Brown, for example, arguably the greatest running back in NFL history. Lou Alcindor, later Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, unarguably, in my view, the greatest college basketball player ever. And then you have Muhammad Ali, who is just, the greatest. And all these folks were not only great athletes, but they were also political athletes. And this is a movement that exploded in 1968 at the Mexico City Olympics, when Tommie Smith and John Carlos, in arguably the most famous image in Olympic history, raised their fists on the medal stand in 1968 and bowed their heads after the 200 meters. Are people familiar with this image by a show of hands? That's very impressive. And I wrote John Carlos's book with him that came out last year about them raising their fist on the medal stand. And I wanted to have the image up to show this to you. I really want to encourage people to go back and actually look at the image, because there's so much in it that you see with them raising their fists, but that you maybe don't necessarily see at the same time. Like, first of all, look at the image and you'll see that they're also not wearing shoes on the medal stand as a protest against poverty in this country. You'll also see that they're wearing garlands around their neck, which to them was a symbol of lynching and violence that had been perpetrated against African Americans in this country. You'll also see, from looking at the image, that they're all wearing patches that say Olympic Project for Human Rights. And they're not only wearing, the Tommie Smith and John Carlos aren't the only ones wearing those patches, but the silver medalist, who's up there too. And a lot of people see this picture and you see a silver medalist standing straight, and people look at that and they think, oh, that must be the white guy. Or just like this random guy, like Forrest Gump, like some guy standing there like, oh, history, my goodness. But that was an Australian runner named Peter Norman, and he was also wearing a patch in solidarity with them. But the thing that I really want to encourage people to go back and look is you can go online and actually see the race itself. And it's in the race that you see what, in my view, is one of the most astoundingly political athletic acts in the history of this country. Because Tommie Smith and John Carlos, they had this plan that they were going to do this on the medal stand. So they brought out their beads and garlands. They had their plan to wear high black socks and not wear their shoes. They brought out the black gloves so they can raise their fists. They brought out the patches. But what was the thing they had to do first? They had to win. I mean, that would have been pretty terrible if they'd come in like 9th. And they were like, wow, we brought all this stuff. What are we supposed to do? So they had to make sure that they were both on the medal stand. So if you go back and watch this race, are there any sprinters here by chance? This person's sitting with Frida, right? Oh, wonderful. As any sprinter here will be able to tell you, if you are running a short distance, 100 meters, 200 meters, your head is always facing in one direction, and that is forward. That is the only thing you're concerned about, is how fast can I hit that tape. You go back and look at this race, you will see John Carlos get an early lead, and he's constantly looking backwards. Where's Tommie? Where's Tommie? Where's Tommie? That's what he was saying in his own head. Where's Tommie? And he was looking back so much that he actually didn't notice that Peter Norman was running on the other side of him. And so then Peter Norman barely won, barely broke the tape first. And they actually were able to organize this 200-meter race in world record time so they would both be on the medal stand. But then they faced a bigger issue. And this wasn't necessarily something they could just paper over. Because Tommie Smith goes over to John Carlos. And I want people to think about this the next time they see this image. And he says, what happens if we get up on that medal stand and somebody tries to shoot us? Now that might sound a little fantastical or paranoid, but you have to think, this is October 1968. Already, Dr. Martin Luther King had been assassinated. Already, Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. Before the Olympics started, hundreds of Mexican students and workers had been killed because they were protesting the Olympic Games. And they knew that violence was very real. This was also an era where, you know, you could walk into a stadium with a gun, and it's not like there was security there. You didn't have that back then. All the things today that we take for granted when we go to a stadium just did not exist. So Tommie looks at John and he says, what happens if we get up there and somebody tries to shoot us? And John says to him, well, you know we're trained to listen for the gun. I just think that's one of the coolest lines ever. So, and he says, and you know we're kind of fast, so we'll do the best we can. So they get up there on the medal stand, they raise their fists, and as John said to me, when they did that, remember there's like 50,000 people looking at them, he said, you could have heard a frog piss on cotton. And just, that's how quiet it was. And then the boos started, and then people started throwing things at them, and then a real sacrifice was made by them over the next many years of their lives. And yet, because they did what they did, the Olympics themselves reassessed a whole series of things that they had done. For example, allowing entry for apartheid nations that did not allow African Americans to compete, nations like Rhodesia and South Africa. For example, hiring more African American coaches. And also, this was very important, like it led to a much more critical look at the person who was in charge of the Olympics, a man named Avery Brundage, who was not a very nice fellow. I'll just put it like that. He was a longtime Hitler and fascist sympathizer who was in charge of the Olympics for decades. And so this was a very powerful thing that they did. And so learning about this history actually also allows us to understand the late 1960s. So you learn sports history, it's a lens to understand US history. And I would be so remiss if I didn't also say that an incredible way to actually understand the history of immigration in this country and of racism faced by Latinos in this country can be seen by knowing the story of Roberto Clemente. and knowing the story in full. And I think you guys are so lucky to have Roberto Clemente Jr. here to speak later today. And I don't know if he's here right now, but he's not here. But either way, an incredible person and somebody who I can't wait to hear what Roberto Clemente Jr. has to say. So obviously, if you're hearing what I'm saying here, you get where I'm coming from, that I think sports is an unbelievable lens to look at and understand the history of race and racism in this country. But that it applies to everything. Like if you have an area of interest, looking at it through sports is an amazing way to understand it. And this is especially true with the history of women in this country. If you look at the history of the interaction between women and sports, it tells a story all its own. Like for example, when organized sports started in this country in the late 19th century, I mean, women, young girls in particular, like girls and boys had always played together. But at the end of the 19th century came this idea that no, sports is about training boys to be leaders. It's about training young boys to be men and lead a new American century. And so for young girls, sports was just something that they were denied. Now, this isn't true of all girls and women. I mean, if you were wealthy, you had access to basically 3 sports. There was, because they had the start of this thing called the country club, which very wealthy women had access to, but you really only had access to 3 sports. One of them was horseback riding, one of them was golf, which as we discussed, not a sport, and one of them was tennis. Now, tennis might sound great, but actually tennis was a pretty horrific thing for women to do in the 19th century. Like, have people ever wondered why women's tennis is the best of 3 sets and men's tennis is the best of 5 sets? Like, it used to be that women's tennis was also the best of 5 sets, but for women to play tennis, they actually had to play in corsets on the court. Are people familiar with what a corset is? It's like, oh, you know, it's like if you saw the movie Titanic, you know, oh, it's like that's what people had to play tennis in. And the problem was that women were passing out on the court. And the people who were in charge of Wimbledon, the actual organizers of Wimbledon, they got together and they said, we have a real problem here. Someone might die on center court at Wimbledon. What are we going to do? And they talked about it and they said, should we get rid of the corsets? No, let's keep the corsets, but let's make it best of 3 sets instead of best of 5. That way they'll stay alive, but still be able to wear the corset. And this actually continued for decades until a 15-year-old, you can look her up, named Lottie Dodd. She won Wimbledon at age 15 because she got a corset exemption because of her age. And after she got the trophy, she said to the organizers, the competition would have been so much better if my opponents had been able to breathe. But this is the way it was for women's sports. I mean, there was a kind of almost, I would argue, hysterical attitude from doctors, from the church, from politicians about any women who wanted to play sports, like an actual hysteria. If women wanted to play sports, like disaster would take place, you know, all chaos, all kinds of things. Women would be, I mean, you really read things in like the Journal of American Medicine that said, like, they'll either become prostitutes or lesbians or some combination of the two that I don't understand. I mean, just a real hysteria. And I actually want to quote the 1878 edition of a very wide-read magazine called the American Christian Review. And what they did was they diagrammed the 12-step downfall for any woman who dared engage in the sinful world of croquet. And believe me, it is a truly slippery slope. Step 1, social party. Step 2, social and play party. Step 3, croquet party. Step 4, picnic and croquet party. Step 5, picnic, croquet, and dance. Step 6, absence from church. I guess so busy with croquet. Step 7, immoral conduct. Step 8, exclusion from the church. Step 9, this one's my favorite, more croquet. Step 10, poverty. That's kind of a leap for me, I don't know. Step 11, shame and disgrace. And step 12, ruin. And you thought it was just croquet. Now, of course, this was an argument about so much more than croquet. It was an argument about the values of sports and competition and toughness and saying women did not have a right to them. But this changed very dramatically with the suffragette movement in this country that actually wrote about sports a lot. And it's fascinating to see how seriously people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, how seriously they took the idea of access to sports as something that had to walk arm in arm with women's liberation. And one of the things that was so important to them was access to a new invention that just actually burst onto the scene in the 19th century, a new invention called the bicycle. I mean, the bicycle was seen as like a revolutionary tool in the movement for women to have full citizenship in this country, because it gave women access to exercise, it gave women access to movement, and this is not a small thing, but you can't ride a bicycle in a corset and a hoop skirt. So if women were going to ride bicycles, it meant that they were also being liberated from all sorts of other constraints as well. And actually, there's a quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton who said, "Many a woman will ride to suffrage when that day comes on a bicycle." And Susan B. Anthony said that the invention of the bicycle did more for women's liberation than I ever could, which I may not agree with, but it's a heck of a statement for her to actually say. But when the bicycle started to become the rage among suffragettes, the Journal of American Medicine in this country actually rose heroically to combat this by coming up with a new disease that they said that they had discovered called the bicycle face, which only affected women, by the way. And they actually wrote, this is in a medical journal, that women who rode bicycles could find themselves victims of, quote, a condition that will leave you with a permanent scowl consisting of a protruding jaw, wild staring eyes, and a strained expression. They're basically saying you'll look like Winston Churchill if you ride a bicycle too much. Okay, now they won't let me leave. Okay. But I think even Churchill would agree that that would be a cruel fate for anyone. But the main point is that if you look at the history of women's sports throughout the 20th century, whether you're talking about women playing professional baseball in the 1940s when they were also entering the factories during World War II, or whether you're talking about the rise of Billie Jean King and the way sports walked hand in hand with the women's liberation movement in the 70s, or whether you're talking about fast forward to today, where it seems like for so many women in sports, it's like if you're going to be a great athlete, you also have to, pose in Maxim magazine or FHM, or you have to look like Danica Patrick, and you see the way that sexism in sports is so deeply tied as a social question to whether or not there are actual movements in the streets combating sexism and combating the way women are portrayed in the media. And one really does need to walk with the other. And I think that that's a talk in and of itself that I think is very well worth doing. But the main issue is that I would like to end you with is that this is a living history. Like everything I talked about, history of women in sports, history of race and racism in sports, it's a living history and it's alive today. And I can completely understand why if you read the sports media, if you read the blogs, you might not see that history, because sometimes you read them and it's hard to even understand where the Kardashians end and the NBA begins. And that's the extent of the sports coverage that we get. Yet if you look beyond the surface, I mean, you can see all the different ways in which sports and politics really start to walk hand in hand. I mean, and sometimes it's silly things like in 2008, Carmelo Anthony, then playing for the Denver Nuggets, the basketball player, said that he was going to score 44 points in honor of Barack Obama becoming the 44th president, and he hopes by scoring 44 points it'll inspire people to vote for Barack Obama. He only scored 28, which I guess was his Woodrow Wilson tribute. I mean, sometimes, so sometimes you get things like that. But then you get like very serious questions. I mean, if you look at the cover of Time magazine just last week, the Johnny Manziel on the cover, this question, should college athletes be paid? Big question. Question that has huge repercussions that I don't think people have even fully wrestled with. But these are political questions. The questions of concussions in the NFL. And what it says that the most popular sport in the United States may actually also be bad for our health. Maybe the equivalent of smoking cigarettes, for example. Like you can try to make it safer around the edges, get a bigger filter, call it an American spirit, but at the end of the day, it is something that is going to be unsafe. And what does that mean for the future of the NFL? What does that mean for the future of youth football? And should kids under the age of 14 even be allowed to play? Or would that actually be derelict of our duty to protect children? Or are we even overprotecting children and we should leave this to the parents? These are huge political issues where my experience is that good people can certainly disagree. Then there's the issue of the public funding of stadiums, which frankly I don't think good people can disagree. I think if you think billionaires should get $1 billion in tax money to build a stadium, I think you're wrong. And I think you're dealing with this right now in St. Louis again, where the St. Louis Rams are asking for $700 million more to build a stadium or to rebuild their stadium and threatening to leave. And when you actually think for a second about how wealthy the NFL is, $9 billion in revenue a year. The idea that their owners can't pay for their own stadiums when we actually need money for bridges, roads, schools, hospitals. This is one of the things that certainly keeps me up at night and has me writing things all the time. There's never a shortage of things to write about. But the one issue that we've seen, I think, in the last year that speaks most strongly to this tradition of sports, politics, and people using sports as a way to make political gains is the issue of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender athletes in the world of sports. I mean, this is something that has changed dramatically. I mean, as recently as a year ago, it was considered to be, if you were a male athlete in one of the big North American sports and you wanted to come out of the closet, then you were facing a very difficult life ahead of you. And then what have we seen? Jason Collins, he comes out of the closet, not just comes out, basketball player, of course. He comes out on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And the opening line of his piece, which he wrote himself, was, "I'm 34 years old, I'm an NBA center, I'm black, and I'm gay." Now, when he did this, Stephen Colbert had this line where he said, "Wait a minute, he came out as black?" Which was kind of funny. But the bigger issue, and by the way, Jason Collins still hasn't been signed to a contract this year, which is a whole separate question. But the idea that not only that he felt like he could do it, but then the overwhelming tidal wave of support that he got on social media from people like Kobe Bryant, Dwayne Wade, his teammate Martell Webster, who for the Washington Wizards, who wrote, "Thank you for being you. I'm proud of you. Your jump shot still stinks." But like all that thing made a huge difference. When he did that, it had a ripple effect that was really dramatic. Robbie Rogers, who's a 25-year-old soccer player, who had probably the most depressing coming out statement that you could ever imagine several months earlier, where he's 25 years old, top of his game, and he wrote, "I'm gay, and therefore I'm retiring, because I can't imagine being gay in a locker room." Well, after Jason Collins comes out, Robbie Rogers unretires and takes the field for the LA Galaxy. When Jason Collins came out, someone who had already come out, Brittany Griner, basketball player, she then came out a second time, not about, I'm gay plus, not saying she came out a second time like that, but I'm extra gay, thank you. But Brittany Griner came out and said, not only am I out and proud, but people should know the reason why you didn't know this in college wasn't because I was in the closet, but because my coach at Baylor told me I was not allowed to come out. And that in and of itself opens one heck of a can of worms about the way in which women's sports, there is a degree of what I would call sexual McCarthyism, of pressure for young women to stay in the closet. According to one survey that was taken, 55% of NCAA women college basketball players said that they were subject to what's called negative recruiting, where the coach came to their house and said to their parents, "You don't want to go to that school, that's the lesbian school, we'll protect you from that, you go to this school." And if people know the story of Renee Portland, who's a Hall of Fame basketball coach at Penn State, where she was for 29 years, and she would say publicly on campus in speeches that her rules, and there's a documentary called, I believe it's called Training Rules, which people should see. Renee Portland would say, 3 rules for my team: no drinking, no drugs, no lesbians, which to me makes Renee Portland the second most embarrassing coach in Penn State history. Sorry, but it's like, because you have this now explosion of consciousness among LGBT athletes, And I would be remiss if I didn't mention my good friend Kai Allens, who became the first trans athlete in history to come out playing for the George Washington women's basketball team at the time. I mean, the fact that people feel this confidence to come out, it actually has major repercussions that have huge political ramifications. I mean, look at the Sochi Olympics in 2014. And one of the big issues with these Olympics is the fact that Russia has adopted a whole series of laws basically criminalizing being part of the LGBT community. And the amount of violence against LGBT people has gone up dramatically. And these laws in Russia were passed unanimously by their parliament. And now there's this huge discussion among athletes. Like, what do we do about this? I mean, because obviously not all athletes are gay, but a lot of athletes have gay people in their family, are allies to the LGBT community. So this question becomes, what do we do? Do we boycott? Do we just stay home? Do we go to Russia and just shut up and play? Or do we go to Russia and protest and risk getting arrested? Because, by the way, that's one of the Russian laws, is that if you are a tourist, you can be arrested for up to 2 weeks for, as they say it, propagating homosexuality. So this question is a live one, and already you have major figures on the international sports scene saying that they're going to go over to Sochi and protest and basically dare Putin and dare Russia to arrest them. Now, when you think about all the tensions that currently exist between Russia and the United States, when you think about issues like Syria, little things like that, and you see how an issue like this can become something that's actually so much more than a sports issue. Although there's a small part of me that thinks that Vladimir Putin, who's, by the way, his Olympics are $30 billion over budget, and they will go down as the most expensive Olympics in history, largely because friends of his have looted the Olympic fund for the last 2 years. Part of me is like, yeah, let's talk about the gay thing. Let's just not look over there at the $30 billion that magically disappeared. But either way, it's going to be very dramatic. And I want to quote Brian Burke, who's the head of USA Hockey, whose son, Brendan Burke, came out and then died in a car accident. And then Brian and his son Patrick started this organization called You Can Play, which is about opening up spaces for LGBT people to play sports. And Brian Burke, who's like this incredibly gruff, like almost, I would say, like military style coach, Brian Burke has said that when he packs his bag for Sochi, he's packing his clothes and he's packing his rainbow pin, and he'll be wearing it while he's there the entire time. And so this is going to be very dramatic and very interesting, and it's a political story and it's a sports story. And when I was writing my article about this, I wrote it for Grantland, one of the ESPN sites. The first person I called was John Carlos from the '68 Olympics. And I asked John, I said, what do you do if you're an athlete? Do you stay home? Do you shut up and play? Or do you go there and protest? And John said, you go there and protest, because if you just stay home or if you just shut up and play, no one will ever know what you had to say. And that's why knowing history is so important. And I'll end by quoting one of my heroes, historian Howard Zinn, because it speaks to this question. He said, we study history not because we want to know more about the past, but because we want to change the future. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time. And before, I don't know if people just stood up to leave, but we do have some time for some questions. This is the best part. I am doing a workshop after this, but in the workshop, just so you guys know, I don't talk that much. I let you guys do a lot of the talking. So if people have any questions about anything I said, any disagreements, anybody who thinks that Winston Churchill is actually a very attractive man and I besmirched his boyish good looks, I'm open to all of this. So
if you have a question, please come down to the front and you can talk into the mic on either side. Thank you.
And I believe we have about 10 minutes, is that right? Okay.
This should be a short one. My wife and I moved to Colorado in 1971, and shortly thereafter on the ballot was, should we have the Winter Olympics in Colorado? And the people voted no. Do you have any comments or anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that hosting the Olympics, the slogan of the Olympics is bigger, faster, stronger, or something like that. I think the slogan of the Olympics really should be something wicked this way comes. I mean, it's not, and let me keep in mind, as a television viewer and as a sports writer, I love the Olympics because it gets us off our sort of high-carb diet of football, basketball, baseball, and it's also one of the few places where you actually get to see and celebrate women athletics on a mass scale. So for all those reasons, I love the Olympics. But if you're talking about actually hosting the Olympics, I mean, you were talking about a situation where the results are very rough. What you usually get out of it is an incredibly high budget, which you're paying for the next ever, because you go so far over budget. You get a hyper-militarization of wherever you live, and you get, at the same time, the displacement of tens of thousands of people, in some cases, to build Olympic facilities. And I've seen this firsthand. I just got back from Brazil, where they're going to end up displacing maybe 80, 90,000 people for the World Cup and then the Olympics. And, I mean, the social cost of that is so incredibly high. There's actually a man named, I mean, I want to get his, it's like Kino Jonwa. I'm getting his name slightly wrong. He's from Tokyo. When Tokyo hosted the 1964 Olympics, he was evicted from his home to make way for the Olympic Stadium. Now Tokyo is going to host the 2020 Olympics. Kino Jonwa is 79, and he's being displaced again. And, I mean, sometimes it's easier to see these things when it's one name and one person. And this time at 79, not only is he losing his home, but he's also losing, he has a small tobacco shop, and that's being torn down as well to make way for Olympic facilities. So I'm not anti-Olympics. What I am anti is the International Olympic Committee, which is as corrupt a body as you could possibly imagine. And I would love to see an Olympics that had one stationary spot, and they would just be in this one location, and people would travel there to travel because travel there to compete. I'm sorry, because when you go to different locales, the results are absolutely disastrous for the people who actually have to live there. Oh, and one last thing is that's not to say people then say, because this is important, like, well, why do people want the Olympics then? And it's like, I'm not saying the Olympics don't make a lot of money for a city. It's just who gets the money. And this is one of my John Carlos quotes that I love so much. He says, why do you think the Olympics only take place every 4 years? It's because it takes them 4 years to count all the money.
Hi, my name is Alyssa, and I'm a senior. I was wondering why you thought that the media latched on to Jackie Robinson as opposed to other African-American athletes like Larry Doby.
I mean, why they latched on to him in 1947?
Yeah.
That's a great question. And another interesting thing about this is 1947, where Jackie Robinson comes into Major League Baseball. In 1949, Reader's Digest did a national poll of who is the most admired American, and Jackie Robinson finished second ahead of Harry Truman, and number one was Bing Crosby, for reasons I don't quite understand. I guess people really like White Christmas, I don't know. But the point is that your characterization of it is absolutely right. Like, the media of that time really did attach themselves to Jackie Robinson in a pretty substantial way, particularly, obviously, the northern media, which was much more in favor of integration than the southern media. So that's part of it. And back then, the northern media is what really dictated news on a national level. I mean, the power of newspapers like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune were very powerful. The other thing about Jackie Robinson was that, of course, he was a veteran coming out of World War II. He was a college graduate out of UCLA, where he was a multi-sport star. His brother, Mac Robinson, was an Olympian in 1936 at those Berlin Olympics. And so when Branch Rickey said, I'm not looking for the best Negro League player, I am looking for a type, that's exactly what we're talking about. And Jackie Robinson, and he was married as well, so there was no risk of anything, untoward happening, like, I don't know, dating. So it's like the search for a type came up with Jackie Robinson. And I think why people are still so interested in Jackie Robinson, like you mentioned Larry Doby. Larry Doby is a heroic figure, first African-American player in the American League. Larry Doby did not necessarily play that well, though. And Jackie Robinson, he won the first ever Rookie of the Year award in 1947, and then he was an MVP in 1948. So you have someone who not only had all this pressure of representation on his shoulders, but then someone who also succeeded. And as we all know from sports, you just have to look at people like Johnny Manziel or Michael Vick. Like, no matter what you're dealing with, if you can succeed on the field, it tends to wash away any other issues that might exist.
Hi, I'm CK from Cambodia. I'm a junior here, and thank you, sir, for coming here. It's a pleasure to have you here. My question is that you mentioned that sport in history has done a lot for the political view in the U.S., such as sexism, racism, and all. So you also end the speech with the quote that the study of history is to change the future, not the past itself. So my question is, how do you see sport in history has changed political issue in the U.S. and how do you see that? How do you predict more for sport to be done for political itself?
And of course, there's this history. I should be clear about this, and only my ignorance prevents me from talking about it, but this is an international issue, the way that sports and politics walk hand in hand and arm. And I mean, from what I've read, I mean, you cannot find a country on earth where sports doesn't play some sort of political role for good or ill in that respective country. And I wish I knew something snappy to say about Cambodian sports history, but I don't, so I shall not try. But I will make this point, though. It's like, I think that I'm sure there are people in this room who someday will be public high school teachers or junior high school teachers or college professors. And I think that whatever your area of study is, you can use sports as a way to teach that area of study, as a lens for people. So if you do want to tell the story of the civil rights movement using Jackie Robinson to do that, or the 1960s using Muhammad Ali, or the women's liberation movement using Billie Jean King, or even talking about, I mean, go back as far as you want, like talking about the role that sports played after the Civil War in this country in terms of as a method of trying to bring the country together. And all of these ways, I think you can find it in whatever your area of interest is, anywhere. And when you do that, my experience is that you're actually then able to connect with students in a way that maybe otherwise you couldn't, because they're interested in sports, and all of a sudden it seems more real to them than dates or just people making speeches or whatnot. Thank you.
My name is Gordon Allison. Thank you again for coming to speak with us. My question is, you talked about briefly the $30 billion that seems to have disappeared out of the upcoming Russian Winter Olympics. Could you go into more specifics about that?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, God. I mean, this is ugly stuff. Sorry, I hit a button for a second ago. Yeah, I mean, first of all, the starting point is understanding that the Winter Olympics is meant to be a much more inexpensive operation than the Summer Olympics. I mean, the Summer Olympics, there are demands for all of that pageantry. There are obviously far more countries compete in the Summer Olympics than in the Winter Olympics, which tend to be northern countries that have access to winter sports. So the first thing is understanding that when we say that the Sochi Olympics will cost more than every other Winter Olympics combined, like if you add the numbers, that's stunning. But when you consider that the Sochi Olympics will cost more than the Beijing Summer Olympics and will be the most expensive Olympics ever, that to me is even more stunning. Now, the way the Olympics operate financially is that there are a series of corporate sponsors that are attached to the International Olympic Committee, and that's part of it. But the real money comes with the construction, and the construction happens locally. Construction is needed to tear down old houses and build new stadiums. Construction is needed to build the kind of facilities that you might not already have, because I don't know about your neighborhood, but when I go outside, I'm not like, hey, I'm going to go over there and luge. You know, there's no luge. You got to build a luge. So people got to build the luge. And all of these things come, so then you have to ask yourself, well, how do you keep costs low? Well, you keep costs low, of course, by having different contractors do competitive bids, right? Well, what Vladimir Putin set up was not competitive bids, but he did it through what's sometimes referred to as crony capitalism, in that he sold out the bids to the people who he was closest to in that particular sector of government, and as well people who are private contractors who are very, very powerful and close to government, and a lot of these folks did not know how to do the work. So you had a series of failed projects that then they had to get to new people on. And one of the reasons these projects failed was that there was a great deal of embezzlement where people then looked the other way. And a couple of these folks were so brazen about the embezzlement that they actually, and people can look this up, they have fled the country because out of fear that they're going to be, one of them says that he's convinced that he's already been poisoned by Putin and that he's going to be assassinated. I don't know how true that is, but this is somebody who's, you know, this is a billionaire saying he fears he's been poisoned by the government. So it's like, it's not like the crazy, crazy stuff you might think. And this whole process has resulted in just massive budget overruns and huge projects that got started but then didn't finish. And that's what's made the costs go on top of costs on top of costs. So basically they've built the facilities 3 or 4 times over with the money disappearing. And that's why they're $30 billion over budget.
Why do you think this hasn't been publicized more?
Well, it's so interesting because like when there have been articles about it on NBC. There have been articles about it on. I mean, if you Google Russia, Sochi, $30 billion, you'll see a ton of stuff. I mean, I think one of the great challenges in media in the 21st century is that there's so much noise. I mean, I sometimes feel like we're all like, you know, has anybody ever had a kitten and you take out a laser pointer and you sort of mess with them? I mean, we're all kittens chasing laser pointers sometimes. You know, like, what's the latest story? Oh my God, oh my God. So it's like you got Putin, who, you know, $30 billion over budget, and yet I get 50 emails about like, dude, have you seen the Mark Sanchez butt fumble? You know, and y'all know what that is. You know what I'm saying? And that's, you know, so it's like, it's hard sometimes to even just, to actually like pound away and get people to focus on this. But I recommend to Google it and check it out. It's been written about in most major publications, but it hasn't been able to sort of, like these days you need something to actually catch fire for people to get attention. Otherwise it just becomes another story that then gets replaced by the next story.
Thank you very much, sir.
Oh, thank you. Sir, my God, my kids don't call me sir. That's very nice. Is that it? Oh, thanks.